Hello, and welcome to another episode of Archives and Anchovies, the podcast about whatever it is I want to speak about that week. This week is a pretty tremendous week in the podcast world for me because we are hitting our 10th episode, which is a milestone for any podcast. I did a quick search right before joining this podcast, and there's only, well, Google says anywhere between 140,000 and 700,000 podcasts on Spotify of the almost 5 million only have 10 episodes and they aren't active. So pretty good milestone. So what I decided to do for 10th episode, and hopefully going forward every 10th episode, is to invite a guest. So today I have a good friend of mine. His name is Sonny. We just have a lot of conversations all the time about random things. So it's ideal for this podcast since I just talk about all kinds of random stuff as it is. We talked a little bit about a topic a few weeks ago. I was considering going to see Rush as a band. They obviously lost their drummer, Neil Peart, about 10 years ago, and they are going to go on tour soon with a new female drummer. So started thinking about what bands do when their members pass away or they retire and things like that. And Sonny and I had a quick one-off conversation. Well, it wasn't quick. It was about a half-hour conversation. It could have been its own podcast, actually, about these things. And we kind of went off on a tangent. But we started talking about, is it really the true members? Is it really still the band? And it just prompted a lot of conversation. So welcome, Sonny, to the podcast, and glad to have you here.
Hey, thanks, James. I'm excited to be here and excited to talk about this.
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting time for me. You've been a big supporter of mine in starting this podcast and listening and trying to maybe help distribute it to some friends to listen to as well. So really appreciate you being a friend of the podcast and glad to have you on. So really, thinking about Rush, and they're going out on tour, and they've got a lot of dates coming up. I was wondering, do I want to go? I ended up not buying tickets because couldn't justify some of the costs that they are, $300 or $400 to go see a show here in Phoenix. Even they had some $97 tickets, but I was way too late for that. So just wanted to maybe get your thoughts on, have you ever thought about going to see a band that maybe doesn't have its original members? And, did you go and did you feel like you got slighted, or was it really a good show?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I have one example of this, and it made me think about how bands are kind of a sum of their parts, but maybe some members, whether they're legacy members, depending if they're founding members, if they were added later, how much does that contribute? And like, what is a band? Is it the brand? Is it the legacy of what they've done? But I went and saw Stevie Nicks live a couple years ago, and with her current band, without Lindsay, right?
Sure.
And I thought it was funny. I was like, I would never go see Lindsay playing Fleetwood Mac hits, with his own band, but 100% I didn't feel like I was missing anything going to see Stevie Nicks play with her band and have someone else singing Lindsay's part. So I think it's an interesting perspective. I think there's a lot of other bands where I'm not totally sure. When we were talking about this topic, it like brought me to this idea of like Theseus ship. Like if you start to just replace all the planks, at what point is it still the same ship? And
Right.
then, if you took all those leftover, parts that they removed and built another ship, are they both Theseus ship? Sort of like what the Beach Boys did when they became two bands, for a period of time. So I think it's certainly an interesting topic, and I think that Rush without Neil is kind of a hard sell, right? Just because of how important he is to the band's legacy.
Yeah, and as you know, I am a backup bass player for Stevie Nicks tribute, and it's kind of interesting because McVie obviously wasn't there because she passed away. It's not a Fleetwood Mac tribute, and Stevie had her own pretty solid career as a solo musician, in addition to what she did with Fleetwood Mac. But it's always interesting too. Like I'm sure when you were there, she did a bunch of hits that were from Fleetwood Mac. In addition to some of her solo stuff. So, it comes down to songwriting credit, maybe. I don't know that people are allowed to play those songs when they do it live. I don't know what kind of agreements they have. Did Lindsey Buckingham have an agreement with Stevie that he got some of the the royalties from the shows? How do you think that works?
Yeah, no, I think that is interesting, and I think kind of going back to the the when the Beach Boys sort of split in two, and they were like Beach Boys Friends and Family, and then the Beach Boys. I think they had an agreement somewhere in place of ticket sales, something very similar. So I have no idea what that looks like for Lindsay and Stevie, but I imagine it, just depending on who owns the catalog, somebody's getting paid, right?
Yeah,
Somebody's getting paid no matter what. So.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I think it's so interesting because there's examples like that, and I think you and I talked about like when does a band just become a tribute band to itself and it like become less special than just going and seeing a tribute band for a lot less money that frankly sometimes has just as talented or even more talented musicians on stage. And so I think there's just so many examples of like if you replace the lead singer, like is Queen still Queen with Adam Lambert? Linkin Park, after Chester passed, replacing him. I think that they all have their own merits and can be viewed with a different perspective.
Yeah, and actually, the cool thing about Queen is actually they don't say they're Queen, right? So they actually specify that it's Adam Lambert. So that's another interesting thing. I don't see any other bands out there saying, "Oh, it's this band with this person." Like Journey replaced Steve Perry. I know Steve Perry wasn't the first singer for Journey, but obviously Steve Perry, that was a big split. And then they had that gentleman that just was awesome, but they didn't say Journey with his name. It was just Journey. So it's also a kind of interesting thing that they shout out the players that maybe got replaced. I know Leonard Skinner is one of those bands that there's like no original band members left, but they still tour. You can still go see Leonard Skinner. So it brings us kind of to, is that a tribute band? Is it a band that is the real band being a tribute to themselves? How does that work? Do I want to go see Leonard Skinner without any members in it? And does it really count as Leonard Skinner and pay premium prices just for the name? There's a lot to it.
I think that if there's I think continuity is probably part of the conversation as
Yeah.
well. However, I feel, just my opinion, that if there are no original members and you're not, also I don't know if it would be right to record new music if there are no original members, but if you're just doing it for nostalgia and ticket sales, then yeah, you're a tribute band that has a licensing agreement. That's my feeling.
Yeah, interesting because I'm wearing a Genesis shirt. I don't know if you can see, and obviously I'm in a Genesis Phil Collins tribute. But 2 years ago, was it? I think they sold their whole catalog of music for like $400 million to Sony. So the question is now that like the label owns the rights, could the label put a band together and then say, "Oh, here's new music by Genesis"? Is that something that I wonder if that's ever happened? I know there's been a lot of places that have sold a lot of artists that have sold their full catalog and their rights and everything like that. Could somebody literally come out and say, "We own the rights," and release new music under that artist? That's a pretty interesting thought. I don't know if that's ever happened.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. Obviously for like PR purposes, I don't know that that would fly well with some of the really big bands. And again, I think that continuity matters. Like it's a lot easier to, I guess, sort of forgive those things if like when we're talking about Theseus ship, I also think of like the USS Constitution, right?
Yeah.
It's been in commission continuously out in the harbor. Yeah, we've replaced like every single part of the ship, but I would say that that's still the USS Constitution because it's been continuously operating as such. But if you take something, and it's say shut down for a little while or there's a quiet period and you come back and you say, here's reintroducing, this band and it's all new members. Um, yeah, I don't think that's the same band at all, and I don't know that people would pay the ticket prices to go see it.
It's kind of, I was just thinking as I'm thinking about like all the arts, maybe music might be uh, unique in that aspect because if you look at like a Broadway show, up here to my right, I have my Phantom of the Opera thing. When I went to go see Phantom of the Opera, that changes casts all the time, but there's still sometimes that they have like original members. Hamilton, I think it was last year, came out, and the person that played Aaron Burr was coming back for like 10 or 15 shows specifically. So that was like a big deal, but they don't make a big deal of announcing, on a program or on something like that with this person. So really kind of interesting that maybe music is unique in that aspect that they mention those particular people that replace other members, and we care about it like it matters, right? If you go to a Broadway play, I don't know who the off, the second person is, but if I go see Rush, I definitely notice one of the three people is not Neil Peart. Even though what I did read that they're going to have all kinds of people. They actually had like a keyboardist. A lot of times they've always had like strings, but they're going to have like other artists like join them and stuff. So I don't really think it's Rush, like a Rush concert like back in the 80s, but it's going to be something that's morphed, kind of like they did their whole career. So
Yeah, I think that's really interesting when you think about just like art and this argument maybe outside of music. You know, if Banksy makes a stencil and some other guy spray paints it, like is it still a Banksy? Or Dale Chihuly, when he had to have one of his apprentices start actually making the work, but he was directing it. You know, if you're the person purchasing it, are you like, I really want this to have been made by the artist's hands? Or,
right.
you know, is the fact that the creative vision is still coming from the artist make it authentic enough to have that value for you?
Yeah, I don't know. And art is crazy expensive. I mean, what was it? They threw a banana. They nailed a
Yeah,
banana to a
that's
place
right.
and it sold for like $250,000. I probably have the amount way off, but it was something crazy. And then the person ate the banana. So like they paid an exorbitant amount of money for a rotting banana on a piece of canvas and then ate it. Welcome to archives and anchovies. We never know where things are going to go. We're talking about bands, and now all of a sudden we're talking about bananas. And actually, bananas are a pretty good fruit. I really enjoy a good banana. I bought, this is totally a sidebar, Sonny. This is just how I roll. But I went to Costco, as you and I have talked about. Costco's awesome. But I went to Costco and bought some bananas the other day. It took almost a week for them to ripen. They were the greenest bananas I've ever gotten. And I was going to say I can't stand green bananas. They have to have some yellow, but bananas as a fruit are pretty high on my list. I don't know about you, but
You
such,
know, I'm not a big banana guy,
yeah.
but as you know, I've just like for some reason my taste palette has absolutely turned like a 180 through the second half of my life, where there's certain things where I always like it just was like a human garbage disposal when I was a kid, and like now I don't like sweet baked goods and things like that. So
Huh.
not a texture thing, but it's just like a taste thing for me. It's just like overly sweet. I like a little bit more tart. So you know, for my money, apples, grapes, pineapple probably at the front of the list.
Nice. My yeah, pineapple's pretty awesome. I probably will eat some in the next few days for where I'm going. I'm going on a little vacation, so that should be fun. The One of the things about bananas, a really kind of anecdotal story, is last night my youngest daughter and I, we were talking about Warcraft. I was playing Warcraft. We'll talk about that some other day. Who knows? Maybe Mitch will want to join and we can talk about Warcraft. But she was saying that there was a banana costume in Minecraft. I don't know if you ever played Minecraft. I never did. I couldn't figure out how to do it, but apparently you could wander around as a giant banana in Minecraft, and that was your character skin. So just kind of one of those odd things. But getting back to this, away from the sidebar of the bananas and the fruit conversation, I think that one of the things that really is pretty interesting about making music, maybe after one of the members of a band, passes away or leaves, is also when they replace that member. So, I think of, Foo Fighters, Taylor Hawkins passed away, and they replaced the drummer. It was quite a spectacle. There's actually a whole long video series. Dream Theater is like my second favorite band. The first time that Mike Portnoy went away, there's actually a whole video series of them trying to find a new drummer and all of the auditions for all the drummers that they brought in, which is actually pretty cool to watch. So, what are your thoughts on if somebody does get replaced, and especially if that person was in another band and now they're in a band that you would listen to? Do you think that lessens also, being a kind of a transient person, I guess you would say, as far as a musician goes? Does that lessen the aspect for you for the new band they're going to?
You know, I think that a lot of artists are going to have side projects, right? And if they're doing something different, then, you know, like good for them. I think in terms of with original bands that for me, probably transparency is more important than pedigree. And so, you know, I think that, like going back to, Lincoln Park, or, Sublime with Rome, these situations that are born out of tragedy, to me feel a lot different than, a much older band who is like, they're just a cash cow, right? So they can continue making that money because of the catalog that they have. And so I think that the purpose of why they're doing it matters. And before we get too far away from bananas, I do want to say bananas, probably one of their greatest use is as a ratio or a scale, when you're taking photos,
Stop
to
it.
show how big something is.
Yeah. Or you probably, I don't know if you've seen the movie, but it also, you can put it in the tailpipe of a police car and it'll stop the car from going.
I hadn't considered that. I'll have to
Oh,
go give the Des Moines PD a run for their money.
look up Beverly Hills Cop. It was a movie with Eddie Murphy from like the early 80s. And one of the scenes, he wants the people to not pursue him in the car. So he shoves a banana in the tailpipe and clogs up the tailpipe and stops the car from running. I don't know if that's actually something that would happen if you clogged up a tailpipe with a banana. I'm not going to try it on one of my own cars. But I've heard about the scale for the banana.
Yeah, it's
It's fun.
it would be hard. Hopefully you don't find an all EV fleet of police cars, because then
Yeah,
you're going
true.
to be ineffective. However, if you approach this from a Mario Kart sort of perspective, you can throw the banana behind you, and that will make the car
Good
spin
call.
out,
Yeah.
and it'll take a while to get caught back up.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that. Maybe I'll start having like just a bunch of bananas sitting in my car in case there's some road rage or something. I can start throwing bananas at people and they'll be like, "Oh my gosh, it's Mario Kart," and I can't even drive now.
That's
Um,
right, and you get yours from Costco, so
yeah,
certainly you'll be able to get a large enough supply to. Um,
especially green ones.
that's right. Now, do green bananas have without the ripeness, are they slippery enough to be effective
Hmm.
as a defense mechanism on the road when throwing them in front of other cars?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that they have to be mushy. They have to be almost brown to be that effective. Because you're right, they would be a little. It might break a window if I throw something like that at a car before
Yeah,
it's too ripe.
yeah. You never see anybody slipping on a plantain.
No, yeah, I don't think I've ever seen that in a cartoon either. I mean, people slip on banana peels all the time in cartoons, so I guess it must be a thing. That could be something that we try out maybe while we're on vacation.
Yeah, the many functions of a banana.
The many functions of a banana. I don't know. How did I get us onto this topic of bananas? What did I?
I think that we were just admiring that it's sort of like the Swiss Army knife of fruit.
Of fruit, yeah. And then there's different ways to eat bananas. So I saw a video the
Oh,
other day.
horizontally rather than vertically, because I do that as well.
Yeah, well, horizontally or just pulling off, excuse me, just pulling off one strip and eating it with a spoon. Apparently, that's also a way that people eat bananas. No, I'm just old school and just rip it off. And I don't actually bite into the banana. I peel off, like I break off pieces of it. So I eat the individual pieces, but that's just kind of how I roll.
Do you compost like the rinds or the peels when you're finished?
No, I just throw them in the trash. I enjoy after about 4 days that the trash smells really good with a banana peel sitting in it. Oh boy, this is one of our little tangents. I think it's pretty funny that we can talk about bananas for 5 minutes in a show where we're talking about the moratorium of bans and how that works. But we could talk about peaches. Presidents of the United States of America, they
Oh yeah,
recorded a song about peaches. So maybe we look at songs that had banana in the title or mention bananas someday, and we can just
banana
kind of roll with that.
pancakes, Jack
Banana
Johnson.
pancakes. There you go. There you go.
That's
Perfect.
right.
Yeah, your catalog is probably a little deeper than mine as far as as a lot of artists go. So that's pretty funny. So as far as going to see bands, I don't really know if there's really any other bands that I want to see. We've talked about the costs of trying to go to a concert today in some of the areas, but I would really, I mean, Rush is my favorite band, so I would really have to really want to go see it with the new one, and I'm probably going to miss out. I'm probably going to regret it. That brings us me kind of the next topic. There have been a lot of bands that I wish I would have seen perform before somebody, passed away and things like that. So do you have some of those bands that, members either are not original anymore, they're not together, or they're really not a band anymore that you wish you would have gone to see?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So, my 21st birthday, I spent at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, which was
Hmm.
the day the music died, right? Very, very famous story of Buddy Holly's tragic passing. And I went and saw BB King on my 21st
Oh, wow.
birthday, and it was only just a couple or a few years later that he passed away, and I feel very fortunate that I was able to go do that. I think I mentally had the same approach when I went and saw Bob Dylan in like 2012. And let me tell you, BB King was a lot better show than Bob Dylan. But and that guy's just gonna tour forever. He's just drinking like unicorn blood or something. He's just gonna live forever. But I think there's a lot of artists that I wish that I had seen. Certainly Ray Charles. It's always bothered me that I never got to see him. And I don't know that I have a list right now, but it's one of those things that typically strikes me when I see a news article that says, this is a farewell tour. And then, that's another question. Can you ever trust a farewell tour? Because these
No,
bands retire more times than Brett Favre and then come back. But,
absolutely.
uh,
Or
but
Philip Rivers.
yeah, or Philip Rivers.
44-year-old Philip Rivers. Oh
I
my
know.
gosh.
Oh
That's
my
a whole
gosh.
nother thing.
The
Unbelievable.
memes right now are
Yeah,
incredible.
they are.
Um, but really, I think it's those sort of headlines that kind of grab me, and then I'm just like, should I? Do I want to spend the money to go do that? Because that begs the question for me when I think going back to see Bob Dylan, I'm like, that was not a good concert, and it was like a
Yeah.
full arena, like wasn't a strong performance. Um, but the answer to that is that there are artists that come up from time to time where I realize, hey, they're getting older, right, and they're probably not going to be around, and this probably is their actual farewell tour. But also, is the performance going to be, reminiscent enough of why I fell in love with them in the first place?
Yeah, it was that way with me with Van Halen. When Eddie Van Halen died, I never saw Van Halen with Eddie Van Halen at all, or David Lee Roth or anything. So I kind of wish now I had gone back. If I could go back in time, I think I would probably go see them because I mean he's one of the most iconic guitarists to ever live, and I missed an opportunity. I wish I would have seen some of the G3 concerts where it was like Eric Johnson, Steve Vai, John Petrucci, all of those, Joe Satriani, all of those people still live, and I think they actually might be reviving that one, so I still might have a shot. But to see them in their prime probably would have been something that I would have liked. And I always think of it when I see those things. I feel like I've missed out. So there's been several. I'm not a huge Eagles fan, but I probably would have enjoyed seeing, Eagles at that point. It's not the Eagles, it's just Eagles. So I'm trying to be careful about how I pronounce their name. So I pronounce their name properly because I correct people when they say, oh, it's the Eagles. No, it's just Eagles. There's no the. So anyway, not to be too pretentious, but that's the thought on that. But there definitely are some people that I really wish that I probably had seen in concert because you'll never have the chance to. And now with like digital recreations, who knows what's going to come out in the next 50 years? Will they be able to take that and be able to do like lost recordings and that kind of stuff and create AI versions of those? So that's going to be interesting. There's a lot of talk about AI music right now. Are artists like some of the actors that are saying that you can use their voice or you can use their likeness or their image? Will they do the same thing? Will they sign an agreement? Let's who's somebody maybe that's aging that we'd want to see right now? Steven Tyler, let's say Aerosmith. Let's say did he sign an agreement with somebody that says you can use my likeness and my voice going forward for the next 100 years, but pay me, $80 million right now. And you can, after I'm gone, you can start making music of me. That's an interesting thought.
It is that's a really interesting thought. In fact, this could easily be its own podcast, and
Oh, let's do it.
just so
Episode
much to
20.
say about it. Absolutely, man. Well, I tell you what, because the reality is that the estate's going to do it when they're gone anyway. So maybe you want to
Probably.
try to get the money yourself. But if you think about like gosh, even going back to like 2013, they did like the holograms or whatever at some of these big festivals like Tupac, and
Hmm.
um and uh and really that sort of stuff is inevitable. It's going to happen with or without your permission if you're a big enough artist. And so that is a good question. At what point do you just say, well, let me get my bag then, while I still
Yeah,
can?
I wouldn't blame people for doing it if they, especially because they want to have their legacy live on after they're gone. But then, how do they do it with like live performance? Are they just recording it, and just bringing out music? Would you buy it? If somebody from, you were just talking John Lennon, let's say they use John Lennon's voice. I'm a moderate Beatles fan. I'm not the biggest Beatles fan. I do like some of their things, but if somebody came out with new John Lennon music because they used his voice and AI created songs in the genre of the Beatles, would I want to buy that? I don't think so. Would I listen to it
No.
on Spotify or Apple Music or Prime Music or something? Maybe. If it came up in a rotation, I'd add a song, but I don't know if I'd want to listen to it. And is it really them? You know?
Yeah, no, it feels wrong to me, especially, if not in careful hands, I mean, imagine somebody getting, discography, rights, and name, image, likeness rights to Kurt Cobain, and then they have him put out a Christmas album in the style of like Michael Bublé, like those, so it's like, who's the protector of the actual brand, right? Um, so that part is scary. I think that we'll probably see a lot more artists who have some sort of legal representation that says you can't ever do this, but those things expire, right? So, yeah, it's certainly an interesting topic.
Interesting you bring up Christmas. We're recording this a couple weeks before Christmas. I did a previous podcast episode on decorations and Christmas carols and things like that, and it's an amazing thing that all of these songs have been around forever, and they still create new ways to bring that song out, and they're still artists. I do one of the bands I like is currently is Pretty Reckless. I don't know if you ever Taylor Momsen. She's awesome. She was the Grinch in
Yeah,
the movie, so you're familiar with it. But she was the Grinch. Now she is the lead singer of Pretty Reckless, and they just came out with the song that she did like when she was 5 years old in that movie as a rock version, and it's kind of all over the internet right now. So it's really interesting to think how they recreate those songs every year, and there's always how many I literally looked up. I said in the podcast, I said like a million versions of Jingle Bells, but there's you just look at Spotify and see how many versions of Jingle Bells are out there, all the way back from like the 30s and 40s up to today that are recorded. It's insane, and every year somebody comes out with another one. So that type of thing. Would we want to say, oh well, John Lennon may have recorded Jingle Bells, but we could market a whole Christmas album in the style of John Lennon and the Beatles. It's possible. I don't know who owns those rights, but obviously somebody could do that. And if they are no longer alive, is it the estate or somebody else that says, "Oh yeah, sure, you can use his likeness and you can use copy his voice"? Just we're both musicians. Just in like a fractal audio, and some different things you can play the guitar tones and it will match it almost specifically by
yeah.
waveform. You could do that easily with somebody's voice and copy it now. So I don't know. It's a really, really interesting, complicated topic. But yeah, you're right. That could be its own topic.
Easily could be its own topic. But I do think it's interesting, just to kind of see like who is more protective of their legacy, and people who have been very outspoken about it, like Scarlett Johansson's like, you can't use my voice. Other artists I think maybe don't care as much. And so it's really interesting to see who's more protective. I think when you and I were talking before, we had kind of talked about just like legacy in general and like who deeply cares about it, and how much harder it is these days to protect your legacy anyway, because we live in this cancel culture age where like you could be on a pedestal for your entire life, and then one thing gets found out about you and you're gone, you're deleted.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, just legacy and how you're perceived, and then how your name, image, likeness is used for a long time. I think is just we could talk about it ad nauseum, but we couldn't talk about it ad nauseum because there's just so much to it.
What's funny about that Scarlett Johansson thing is she came out and said, "Don't use my likeness," and that just prompts people to use your likeness more. So it's like, well, let's try to, in this new age of where we don't actually have too many laws governing, the use of AI yet. Let's see how far we can push it and how far it'll go. Because they did it anyway. So I think that's the way it's going to go in the future for people too.
Well, and that's the thing, right? It's the software is readily available for you or I to do the exact same thing. It doesn't take a major studio, to do this anymore. You think about when Fast and the Furious happened and they sort of deep fake, Paul Walker, or when Star Wars did the same thing with Carrie Fisher. I mean, you or I could just pull up our computer and make one of those right now. We could just do it with an app on our phone. So it's you're not just saying no to studios. You're trying to control really anybody with a smartphone in their pocket, and that's impossible.
Yeah. And just looking at YouTube and things that are on, social media where people are making stuff, there's a lot of like those, movie trailers and things like that people make. And they're starting to get so stinking good. You actually, if you didn't read the comments and knew it was fake, there's, I've been duped a couple of times where I'm like, dude, that's awesome. But then you realize, oh, it's fake. And they use some of the footage from the previous one, or they just AI generated. But um, I think, unfortunately, I think that that's going to be part of what's going to happen in the future, where it's gone from real acting, which I remember seeing an article on or an interview with Ian McKellen when he was doing Lord of the Rings. He played Gandalf, of course, and he said that standing in front of a green screen for 10 hours a day is not acting. And so, if we get to that point, there's going to be now even less acting, where people are going to just be able to do it via AI, and it's going to be a digital recreation. It's going to change the industry forever. And it's the quality of the product that's getting put out probably will be pretty good, and it's really just entertainment. So again, are you paying for, you want to see Tom Hanks because you want to see Tom Hanks in a movie? Or if it's Tom Hanks likeness and you're still entertained by it, is that still okay? I mean, it's kind of similar to what we're talking about with the bands.
Yeah, I think, it's tough because we're still really got a long way to go in terms of AI music sounding good.
Yeah.
I've played around with Suno, I think just like a
Hmm.
lot of other musicians have, and it's an incredible tool. I think especially for sort of just like building like melodies, instrument stuff, and the fact that it can mix itself pretty well.
Yeah.
But in terms of like vocal performances and things like that, it's not there yet. And I think with the videos, gosh, it's getting so much harder. I mean, they're just rapidly developing these models that make things look more and more realistic. So for me, I try to train my eye to some of the tells, which is one, I think speech doesn't link up that well a lot of times with the mouth movement. And then also, for some reason, I think that it really struggles with depth of like where that person is in relation to the camera, or or where a microphone would be. So somebody could be like a football field away and they sound like they're like right next to you.
Yeah.
Um, but those things are going to be fixed in a year probably. So
Yeah. I don't know. The AI music, I think what you're talking about for the vocals, you could just make all of your backing tracks via
yeah,
AI music, and then sing your live vocals to those, and nobody would know. You don't have to pay other musicians. It like you said, it does an incredible job of mixing already. I know there's a whole culture out there, and there's whole Spotify channels of just AI generated music. Well, actually, I'm going to take that back. I don't know if there's Spotify channels. I know there's Community that they have AI specific. It's all generated by AI. But heck, you could do all of your, like actual music, and then do your own vocals and record it over that, and it would be done. So it's pretty crazy. At some point, is it going to be that way for shows? Look at the Sphere in Las Vegas. Could you have something where it is AI generated music that's gigantic on the screen in that amazing venue? And would that be something that people would pay for? I would guess they probably would. But I don't know.
There's definitely going to be an audience for it, I think, and it's funny. I was just thinking the other day, like, voiceover work is one of those professions that I'm just so glad I never got into.
Yeah.
You think about these people who record for Audible or other audiobooks, for a living, or commercials, things like that. That's pretty disposable. It's like one thing when you're talking about music, but it's another thing when you're just talking about narration. And I just can't imagine that those people are going to have much work left in the next few years.
Do you think that that's going to replace also people doing like animated films and cartoons and things like that? I think of like watching those people in the studio interact with each other and playing off each other. I always think of the Toy Story ones where at the end they would show, Tom Hanks and um, what's his name, who played Buzz Lightyear. I can't remember his name. Tim the
Oh,
Toolman Taylor.
yeah, Tim Allen.
Tim Allen, yeah, and they were actually interacting in the booth, and you could see their facial expressions and things like that. I don't know. Will AI get as good as that will be? And also, will it have blooper reels? Because the blooper reels are half the entertainment of some of those movies.
Yeah, no, those ones and zeros, they don't have bloopers,
Yeah,
man.
I know they don't
That
make
would be a pretty
errors.
sad reel. That would just be like a computer shutting down. But yeah, no, I don't think that AI is. I think it's probably a ways away from having chemistry with itself and having right comedic timing and things like that make some of the most iconic moments in motion picture entertainment, and some of the scenes that we remember were like very organic, right? So I think we're probably a ways from that, but I just say never, because if you would have shown me 5 years ago what we could do at this point, I would have never believed it.
Yeah, that's true. And tying that back into the music, it's really all about the audience. So when we're talking about these bands and we're talking about people that either passed away or been replaced, and you go see the music, it's really entertainment, and it's still a big dollar business, and it's something that is going to continue on. I think. I don't think that ever. I hope that live performance doesn't go away. I think that there's always going to be a time that people are going to want to see live performances, whether that be a festival or something. I mean, that's a whole nother topic. When you talk about festivals, a lot of times there's just an individual artist or an individual singer that plays with a band. They don't know who they're playing with. At that point in time, it's just they get together and they just play with those musicians that are on the stage. Sometimes, a lot of times festivals, it is the band, but I think it's going to keep going on. So back to your ship theory. It's not the same ship, but I still think it's going to be entertainment for people, and they're going to keep going.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really fair assessment, and I really feel the same way. You painted this imagery though in my mind that I'm like it's so stuck there. I'm just imagining like MIT robots with like silicone flesh, playing AI music on a stage, and it's just like how much different would that be from a person? We've come a long way since the Chuck E. Cheese rats, so it'll be interesting to see if those two things ever converge. I'm sure they
Well,
will.
yeah, I'm sure they will. I don't know if it's going to be just that they're going to look like robots, but even some of the robots that they're making to look like humans now are getting so close to reality. You may never know, especially if you're seeing like a music video or something like that. You just don't know. I don't know, but it gets back to then at that point, can you call yourself the Beatles? Can you call yourself Journey? I have a friend that is the keyboardist for the current version of Toto that's touring. And I should say he's not a friend, he's an acquaintance. I've played with him a couple times in the past, and is super, super awesome, amazing musician, plays like everything. But like, is that really still going to be those bands that we're going to go see if it's a mechanical version? I would definitely say no. But again, it's where your entertainment dollars are going to go. So this has been a super fun discussion. We could probably go on for hours and hours and hours talking about this, but maybe some final thoughts for us. Do you think that if a band replaces a member, or they replace two members, they are just living off of that band's name, and should they create something altogether? Like I think of Mike Portnoy. He's been in the drummer for Dream Theater, who's back to being the drummer for Dream Theater, but he was like with the Winery Dogs. He was with something called Liquid Tension Experiment, which was basically all the members of Dream Theater minus the singer. Do you think it's okay for all those bands to still call themselves that name, even though they've replaced so many people?
Yeah, I really think transparency is probably the most important thing here, right? You go back in time and people were pretty upset when Milli Vanilli got caught lip syncing, right? Now you already know when you watch the Macy's Day Parade that all of those artists are lip syncing on those floats
Yeah.
because the audio situation is just impossible. So, I think transparency probably is the biggest thing. If people are being honest about it, look, you're not going to please everybody, but I think that most people, as long as you're being forthright about this is what we're doing, and not trying to do it in silence, right, and just sell it as the same thing, then I think that it's acceptable to the majority of people.
You just ruined the parade. I didn't know they lip synced. I thought all that was
Uh,
real. You mean like all the way back to like Britney Spears, like dancing around doing backflips and things like that, but she sings every vocal line perfectly? Are you saying that's not true?
I don't want to take away from the incredible cardio capacity that so many of these artists have, because there are
Uh,
some
there
artists
are.
who can really dance and sing at the same time and do it live. However, yeah, I think it's funny though, because it was so taboo that
Yeah,
artists would
it was.
downright lie. They would just, I didn't lip sync, that was me live, but we know the truth now and we don't care. So
Yeah. Do you remember that the famous Red Hot Chili Peppers Super Bowl, where they were playing and they were playing and playing, and then all those pictures came out of Flea, and his bass wasn't even plugged into anything,
yeah,
and so they're obviously not playing, they're actually playing their instruments, and that was long before that was long before everybody would Photoshop everything and like remove that, and they would say, oh, that's a fake image. I mean, they had it live on video and close-ups, and there's just nothing plugged into the input jack of his bass, so he for sure was not playing, but the bass was loud and clear. I mean, it was an amazing performance that he had. So, and I'm not trying to bag on Flea, because I love him as a bass player, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers are awesome, but just goes to show you that they didn't play even at that, and that's the most widely viewed show of the year, is that show. We will not get into a discussion right now about Bad Bunny being this year's Super Bowl performer. Maybe closer to the Super Bowl we could talk about great Super Bowl performances, but we're not going to get into that in this episode. But I really want to thank you for making episode 10 special. I really appreciate your friendship, your willingness to come on and do a video podcast episode, not just an audio podcast episode, but actually come on video with me. It's been a tremendous time for me to be able to share with you and talk about stuff that we love. I don't know if we really finished the topic, so there might be a part 2 someday. We'll
yeah.
see. But just want to say thank you and really appreciate it.
Yeah, James, I think it's been just really incredible watching this develop, and even from the very first episode, through the next few episodes that I've listened to. I've still got to do a little bit of catching up, but it's been really fun, watching everything develop. And congratulations on getting to 10 episodes, and we'll celebrate again when we get to 20 and 100 and beyond. So thanks
Yeah.
again for having me on. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And to all of you out there listening, just want to say thank you for your continued listening. Check out a couple of the previous episodes that we mentioned. One talks about, there's a lot of music things that we talk about, because for the most part, it's a history, but / music history education channel is what I'm really trying to do. But as we talked about bananas for a while, we just go off on topics. So give a couple of those episodes a listen. Want to thank you. Hopefully, those that are listening in a car, driving, not watching video, hopefully in the car, but also just driving safe. And I look forward to our next episode of Archives and Anchovies. Thanks so much.